more of your questions answered. So in this section, I've tried to group together some of the questions around the phone system, but also a little bit around access and how certain people might get into the system, along with how we might manage some of the tricky situations that come up. So let's start with how do we ensure our most vulnerable patients have good access? This is something which is always a problem for everyone, I think. And the main thing I think that this has done is it's taken away the queue from the front desk, which means that vulnerable patients, if they feel they do need to speak to someone face to face, they can come to the front desk and they can speak to one of our patient services advisors there, who will take their information down on the form, which collects the same data as they would over the phone, and they can take them aside into a room to be able to do that in a private way if that's necessary. Also, we can flag on our notes the patients that need more support and are more vulnerable, so that when they do call through, the person answering the phone has that immediately flashing up, and they can give them the time perhaps that they need. That's the way that we manage it. How do we manage patients who refuse to give the patient services team any information? Obviously, most patients don't want to give out information over the phone to someone they don't deem to be necessary to hear all of their intimate details. This is not unusual, and I think a lot of people might feel, oh, the receptionist is just being nosy. We do a couple of things which are based on psychology to try to improve the likelihood of someone being able to give that information to the reception team. The first thing is in our telephone message, which is recorded often by one of the doctors, and we feel that trust then transfers to the person answering the phone, and we explain the reason for them giving that information. The second is that in our practice we've got the clinician right there with the patient services team, and that they can say that they are going to be relaying this immediately to the clinician, and that often breaks down a lot of the other barriers that there are. Obviously, there are still going to be those people who are not at all comfortable to give out any personal information, and if that's the case, then they just get put down for a clinical call and one of the team will call them back. But it is a very small proportion of patients that don't choose to give the information to our reception team. How do we avoid patients visiting the surgery at 8 a.m. if they can't get through on the phone? Well, I think the fact is people still feel that it is more convenient for them to call, even if they're having to wait on the phone to get their problem dealt with, than to have to come all the way down to the surgery. They would have potentially been queuing in the morning and still not necessarily have had their problems answered. So this has just gone away. If I move then on to the phone call question, a few people wanted to know how many calls we were getting a week. Well, I think in the last count we got about 1,400 calls per week coming in, with about 366 of those being on a Monday. Now, not all of those are ones which need to be dealt with clinically, because that segues onto another question, which is how do patients book in for chronic disease checks? How do we get administration dealt with? How are people booking in for nursing appointments? Well, all of those things are dealt with by other teams within the practice and don't need to come via the clinical triage. So the reception services managers will take on board things like the booking of chronic disease, clinic appointments, nursing appointments, and administration things, and they can divert those to the best member of the team to deal with those issues without bothering the clinician at that point. So although 366 calls do come through on a Monday, then we're not expecting the clinician to be dealing with all of those. And some of them, even if they are, they're just going very rapidly to decide the place for them to go. How many minutes do you allow clinicians per patient to call the patient back? 5, 10, 15. I guess that's a question around, once the clinician has decided that the patient does need a call back, what sort of slot type do we put it into? Well, we've got round that. We book into clinician appointments on the day, and all of our GP appointments are now 15 minutes, because we know that if we're getting people to the right place, those quick appointments that we would have had to catch up, they've gone. So we're now giving people the time to deal with the complex patients. And so if we think that something is going to be quick, then we might split that into 2 slots. We've also, as a result of this, opened up new slot types for specific problems. So quick skin checks, we book into shorter appointments. But there is no 5, 10, 15-minute appointments. For the duty team, the list that they deal with, they just get put onto a list and we get through everything that comes in and gets put on that list in the day, many of which are dealt with within a minute or 2 because they're really very simple things that wouldn't take a great deal of time. What is our balance of routine versus urgent on the day? Again, we don't sort of differentiate this too much. We know by looking forwards how much space we have over the next few weeks, and we would not book forward appointments into days where they are going to be tight. We also have a member of our administration team who does the impossible task of managing the rota, and she looks through all of our appointments and looks at the days where we've got perhaps a slightly smaller clinical force on the day, or when we know, for example, we've got a bank holiday week, she'll perhaps block a few of the appointments each day to make sure that we've got the capacity to deal with the on-the-day demand on those times. But again, having the clinician there making the decision means that you can really flex things, and you can have that, if you're organised, chance to look forward and book people into the most appropriate slots and the most appropriate days. We've got a little question there about how many DNAs we get. Well, we don't actually get too many. We get a few, and I've never heard of one of our clinicians complaining about a DNA. I don't think any of us is stuck with an insufficient amount of work to be doing on a day. It can be frustrating if you're struggling, but we find that we get things fitted in, and actually our DNA rate is quite low. But I suspect that changes from surgery to surgery based on your demographics as much as anything else. There is, of course, the reminder text messages which will go out to patients who've booked ahead. How do we show the workload done? Is it clear how much is dealt with by the triaging GP? Well, we don't look at this too much because we trust that our team are going to be doing a good job and working hard. But early on, when you're looking at whether the system is working for you and whether you need to tweak things, that's where we do look at the data. And this is where having a good template where you're capturing the ideal location for a patient to be seen versus where they end up and who deals with it is really useful, because you can very rapidly draw that information out without having to do very in-depth searches, and you can then see where the work is going and who's doing it. Let's see, any others? How long is the average wait on the phone now compared to before the new system? I can't compare to before the new system because clearly people were not perhaps waiting necessarily as long, but they were being, not waiting long to be told call back tomorrow, and that's not really a very good measure. I know that our average wait time now is around 5.5 minutes, and the average talk time is around 3 minutes when the patient does get through to the patient services team. The maximum wait time, well, that can go out to 32 minutes, and I do feel that this is where some of the new telephone queuing systems and callback systems will be beneficial to patients, although the therapeutic wait, which used to keep people away from A&E so effectively, is no longer going to be there. There was also a question about who our phone company was. Well, they're called Focus apparently, but they're just the telephone company. We were not on cloud telephony yet, but that is happening very soon. So I think that's all of the questions from this section. Again, as always, I hope this is useful and helpful, and we'll move on to the next and hopefully last set of questions shortly. Again, if you want to learn more about it, please do read my blog or consider buying the course where we teach you how to implement this sort of system in your own practice. See you soon.